नमस्कार दोस्तों, आज के इंडिपेंडेंस डे स्पेशल सीरीज के थर्ड सेगमेंट में, आज के प्रोग्राम का थर्ड सेगमेंट में आपको फिर से स्वागत करते हैं। आज हमारे साथ अमित सेनगुप्त जी, जो खुद एक बैंकर है और इकोनॉमिक मामले में जानकार है, पॉलिटिकल एनालिस्ट है, हमारे साथ जुड़ रहे हैं। वो बात करेंगे हाउ इंडिया बिकम एन इकोनॉमिक सुपर पावर इन लास्ट 76 ईयर्स, इस टॉपिक पर। तो अमित जी, आपको हमारे चैनल पे स्वागत है एंड ओवर टू यू।
थैंक यू वसुधा जी। तो क्या मैं इंग्लिश और हिंदी मिक्स करके बात कर सकता हूँ तो आसान
डेफिनेटली,
होगा?
नो प्रॉब्लम, एज यू विश।
ओके, सो फ्रेंड्स, गुड इवनिंग, and right at the start of the show, let me request you to subscribe to this channel and comment as to what you feel like about the contents. And what we are going to do today is we're going to discuss uh, some of the factors that have influenced India in rising from number 10 to number 5 in on the global economic scale. Uh, so what was happening since independence was, initially when we became a republic, so independence largely came with the formation of the constitution, and once we had our own constitution and started framing our own policies and implementing our own policies, that is actually when we can say that we stood as an independent nation, which was in 1950. Since then, we have seen that people who came to power did certain things that were which they thought right for the country, but at the same time there was less alignment to the basic structure of our heritage, the basic way our society was designed and the way our society functioned. So while some of these steps that these people took, they were largely educated in the West. So some of these things that the people did were actually sort of copying the West and trying to bring India aligned with the Western way of governance. Largely because they had probably little idea of the genetics of our civilization, because most of them, instead of coming from the roots of our civilization, had more of Western education, Western values in their upbringing. So at that time, when we were sort of down under, anything would have been good for India. Anything, whatever they did would have been good for India, and that's exactly what happened. Initially, we had, especially from the banking terms, we had old banks which were being given new names, merged into new banks, etc. And so these things were happening at which was appreciated by most of our crowd. But as we grew, the differences started to show up because we started depending on what the government would give to the people, almost in a like a socialist structure. Now, while the socialist structure helped us come up to a certain level, beyond that, it definitely did not benefit us much. And at the same time, as happens in most post World War II democracies, the hunger for power and misuse of power, subsequent misuse of power, robbed us of what we could have achieved had we focused on our potentials in an honest manner. So, within the very first few years, we saw corruption creeping into our system. And as time passed, this corruption grew. Now, this corruption was oriented around power as well as money. So, while the lawmakers did not use their power in the correct way to take the country forward, it would not be wrong to say that these lawmakers had a disproportionate growth in their money, and this money was actually coming out of the taxpayers' contribution towards the Indian economy. So we saw these families, these people grow immensely, almost like in a parabolic manner. The towards affluence, while the poorest of the poor remained there without the basic amenities which they really never got. When I say really never got, what do I mean? I mean to say that there were certain provisions in the constitution which would help them enhance their economic capabilities, move more towards getting their rights or realizing their rights. But to a very large extent, this remained a distant dream. So, in the initial few years, anything that was done appeared great because we were actually below par. But very soon, this stagnated, especially when we compare it to the growing population of the nation. Now, this very conveniently was termed as the Hindu rate of growth, which actually moved our focus away from the fact that we could have achieved more than what we were achieving. So we saw that there was the 5-year planning commission, etc., etc. But at the ground level, if we see the improvement in the poorest of the poor, that bottom line did not see the growth or the realization of their rights which they expected would come to them after independence. Now, honestly, I feel that 1950 is the real uh, year when we became sort of independent, because till then we were between 47 and 50, we were still holding that dominion status with a governor general literally appointed by the queen. Now, this continued. A important moment in our history, post independent history, was the emergency, post which we saw that there would be great difficulty for political parties getting majority on their own. Now, if I have to leave out the election that followed Mrs. Gandhi's death, then we'll see that largely it was a tussle that how to cobble up an association of parties which would help people grab power in Delhi. And naturally, if there is a power struggle with total uncertainty of how long a government would last, then it is but natural that these power hungry people would try to make most for themselves while they were in power. And right up to 2014, we saw a series of governments which, in spite of maybe having some good intentions, could really not do much because nobody could stand on their own. No political party could stand on their own. Now, it was 2014 when, due to whatever reason, frustration of people, being more aware of what's going on outside India, plus the success stories that came out of a certain state, in spite of all this, what was going on in the rest of the country, we moved towards a single party majority. Even that was a coalition, but there was one party which got majority on its own. Plus, when we look at the coalition, they got some more seats. So, this was a watershed point in the history of India. And if we look at India, the political system of India, we'll see that there were three main streams. One was the Congress, and people and parties who, if they were not in the Congress, had the same mentality as Congress. The next were the communists, or parties which aligned with the communist values. And the third was Bharatiya Janasangh. Now, of these three, if we were to go down to the empirical values that held these parties together or were the reason of their formation, then we'll see that both Congress and the communists were founded on values that were not originally Indian. It was only the Bharatiya Janasangh when it was born, they had to distinguish themselves by focusing on the values that were, you know, that came from our heritage, if I may say so, cultural, political, in every way. And we all know that Jansangh ultimately was reborn as BJP. So in 2014, when we see BJP coming to power with the numbers which would have given BJP by itself, even outside NDA, a complete a majority, a clear majority, this was a moment that signaled a big change not only in our political status but in the collective political mindset of India. Now, one may go in and say that they never really got 50% of the votes, which they didn't. But still, whatever they got gave them majority in the Lok Sabha, which we all know is the driver of our policies and our policy implementations. So, when this happened, there were very high expectations from the alliance, the NDA alliance that came into power, and therefore there was, on the one hand, there was a big support that whatever Modi did would be accepted by the people. But on the other side, there was also a risk that if he did not come close to meeting the aspirations of people, then he was, just standing on the razor's edge. Then what we saw post 2014, there was a series of reforms that took place. Now, these reforms, some of them were expected, some of them were not expected, and some people were doubtful about how these reforms would eventually impact our economy. So I'll just go briefly now through these some of these reforms. The supply side policy reforms was brought about. There was a formalization of the economy that was forced. There was the RERA Act, the Real Estate Regulation and Development Act. There was a digitalization of our entire social transactions in a very, very strong manner, which commonly is called the JAM model. There was the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which again some people thought was just a lip service, but they were not looking at the larger picture of these blocks gradually coming into place. There was a inflation targeting, which was a very flexible uh, model, but at the same time, constant review of that model helped us contain inflation to a very large extent. There was a strong focus on FDI, and the government's policies were coming out in support of corporate profits. Now, this is a big change from what was there in the pseudo socialist model that we were following before. The government openly supported corporate profits because, to be frank, India is not 100% socialist society or doesn't have a 100% socialist mindset, and there was no point paying lip service to socialism. And the MNC sentiment thus got a tremendous boost, and it reflected in our corporate atmosphere. At the same time, there was the introduction of GST. The way that GST was implemented and the way that GST would work saw how we were becoming more and more oriented towards digital transactions, and it was very clear that we were undergoing an economic revolution. Now, when I say the economy was being formalized, what I mean is before 2014, or right from 47 to 2014, tax collections was, not a strong drive. So the current government, when they came in, they put a huge push on transparency. They wanted to boost tax collections, and they also empowered businesses. Now, when they brought corporate tax at par with the peers and infrastructure of investment, with infrastructure investment, this was one of the biggest supply side policy reforms that we saw ever since independence. And using the JAM model or the JAM Trinity, a huge change was brought in the transfer of subsidies. This, even though it seemed to be sort of washed down by the media, again was an empirical change made to the manner in which the poorest of the poor were supposed to benefit from public taxes. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code was modified. And of course, as I said, there was targeting of inflation, focus on FDI, and so on. Now, the inflation targeting, coupled with the relaxed fiscal policy, had its impact on the lives of the common man. And therefore, this inflation targeting had a huge impact on the lives and the cost of living. So, with all these things coming into place and the government not worrying about pleasing coalition partners, we saw long term policies which were laying the foundations of the stability of our economy and the progress of the nation. And that had a huge impact when we were actually hit by the pandemic, because India was able to effectively manage the inflation that hit many nations around us. Now, of course, people complain that oil prices were rising and reduced reliance on foreign portfolios with the US recession, global capital flows. But in spite of all that, when it came to the standing we had, we were able to stabilize ourselves, and this stability led to a profit boom for both the corporate and the stock market investors. And this was clearly a breakaway from profits or stock market uh, returns being related with global oil prices. So India's export uh, markets also grew, and this gradually mitigated certain risks that we were taking. However, the global recession is still a risk. 2024 general election outcome possibilities is still a risk. Now, this could impact our commodity prices if there are supply outages and a shortage in skilled labor, because at the pace we are growing right now, we will need employable people coming out of our education system. And that is going to be one of the areas where we really need to focus, because this could be our stumbling point. Now, we know that today we are at number 5, and we will probably surpass Germany by maybe 2027 and Japan by 2029. Now, if this holds good, by 2029, which is about 5 years of the third term. So, if this current government gets a third term, then by towards the end of the third term, it is strongly possible that India will become the number 3 economy in the world, next only to US and China. However, one thing needs to be credited, that the unlocking of the economy in 1991 lay the foundations for all of this, which cannot be denied. However, what 1991 did to in terms of economic liberalization was actually never realized till Modi came to power. Now, GST is one of the things that we must give credit to, though it had a rough shot in its initial days. But as time went by, every month it was setting a new record. That means GST was actually, see, the businesses were as usual, people's transactions were pretty much the same. So, what did GST do? What GST effectively did was plugging the revenue leakage. Once this revenue leakage was plugged, then we saw a huge growth in the collections. However, still, I believe some rationalization of the tax slabs need to be done. Uh, Certain things which are still at 28% of GST probably could be little more rationalized, and maybe the fuel, which is one of the essential commodities, can be brought under the ambit of GST. There is also another thing that has impacted the taxpayer. That is there was supposed to be an appellate tribunal, but especially to deal with GST disputes. But this has not happened. And if this can be put in place, then I believe there will be a huge increase in the ease of doing business and uh, controlling the chaos and confusion that and sort of distrust that is still there in the taxpayer. Next, we come to the banking reforms. Now, in the banking reforms, the major thing that happened was uh, this is not a very common term, but I prefer to use this, the R4 implementation. The policy uh, of 4 Rs, which is recognition of the potential that is there in the system, recapitalization of the banks in order to optimize the assets that we had, quick resolution of the problems that were sort of choking our system, and the reforming. Now, this is a very important thing. If you looked at the time when Modi just came into power, if you look at the figures of the NPAs of the banks, they were astounding figures. Now, these NPAs needed to be addressed. So I think that has been done pretty much efficiently. Now, they what the government also did was they started infusing capitals into the public banks, the public sector banks. And I think since 2015, the government has roughly uh, pumped in about 3 lakh crore rupees in the banking system. Now, as a result of all these steps, what has happened is the NPAs have fallen to a 6-year low of 7.6% as of March last year. While the capital to risk weighted asset ratio, this has improved upwards to 14.6% again as of March 22. Add to this the mega merger of the 10 state owned banks into 4 banks, thus consolidating the strengths and optimizing, or rather bringing about a synergy to create bigger size, stronger banks in the public sector, which is a major achievement for this particular government. However, the public sector privatization and the banking laws amendment still have to be looked into carefully, and these can bring uh, big changes to our economy and further optimize on the government's usage of public funds. Now, there was this big thrust towards digitalization. Okay, before that, there is another thrust that the government has put on the MSME sector. Now, the MSME sector was very loosely structured. Now, with the help of the Niti Aayog, the government has brought about a strong domestic manufacturing system. Of course, the Atmanirbhar Bharat and all those schemes. So there is a
So,
strong,
it's a little bit precisely.
yes. Did you say something, Vasudha ji?
हाँ मैं बोल रही हूँ जरा छोटे एक्चुअली हमारा टाइम लिमिट है इसलिए थोड़े छोटे
Ah,
करके
okay.
बोलिए
Okay, fine. So, okay, we'll quickly go through the points then. See, the uh, the uh, the focus on the MSME sector, which we recently saw even in the uh, that Silicon conference that we had in Gujarat. These are things that will exploit the strengths of our skills, and all we need to do is bring these things together and give it a shape so that we can attract capital from the outside world, generate employment within the country, and also export our value added products outside. So I think now the government scheme, this is for the semiconductor thing that we just saw, is coming to around 10 billion US dollars, which is going to, I think, bring a very good change. So next, we'll quickly come to the UPI that was done. The UPI payments interface, this people thought would not take off, but surprisingly, entire India they went and subscribed to this system, and the huge popularity, it is making huge changes in India's transaction world. I think today about 76% of our transactions or are going through the UPI, and uh, the person to merchant and the person to person payments has emerged as the most popular payment method amongst our consumers. Even globally, I think we are touching somewhere around 46% of the global payments which are being done digitally. Now, this also plugs a lot of leakages that were happening, a lot of malpractices that were going on, and this people may not realize that this thing about UPI would not have succeeded if we did not go for the JAM scheme, the Jandhan, Aadhaar, and the mobile. When these three come together, then they can actually create a synergy that most people did not imagine exists. Then we saw that the plugging which is happening through RERA, we know that how RERA has plugged a lot of gaps in the real estate transactions. We know that the insolvency and bankruptcy code, which is also commonly known as IBC, which makes it easier for banks to recover their defaulted loans. So these things have also helped us. Now, so this, what was a nation that was actually reeling under the pressure of leakages, that has completely changed. That has completely changed. So, in just to summarize what I was saying, the the way that India has gone about in the last 8 to 9 years, and the way that our economy has taken, grown by leaps and bounds, this is largely due to the policy reforms of the government in the corporate sector, in the banking sector, and in the uh, uh, transactional area. So once again, that I would come back to where I started, that recognizing NPAs, resolution and recoveries, recapitalizing the public sector banks, and reforming the financial ecosystem, these are the major four pillars on which our economy is growing today. And I cannot see any reason why this could be derailed if the current government were to continue for a third term. So that is in the summing of how the Indian economy is doing today. Vasudhaji, over to you.
Thank you, sir, for coming to our channel at Darshak Dekhte Rahiye Think Tank India. Please share, subscribe, like, and comment on our channel. Namaskar.